Hi, I'm Shuangyu Yang, and now I will give an presentation of an analysis on air pollution of five major Chinese cities in the last decade from 2015 to 2025. So, at first, I will talk about air pollution, give a basic definition of how we measure it, and then I will go on to my question. Then I will talk about some data cleansing and get to the actual analysis with graphs and present in the end my conclusions. So air pollution nowadays is basically measured by the air quality index. I will refer to it as AQI later. And it's used for reporting daily air quality. Basically, the higher the AQI, the higher pollution levels and the risk of getting respiratory diseases. From 0 to 100 is very good air quality. And from 100 and above, the air is basically polluted. And healthy people are advised not to stay outdoors if AQI is above 200. AQI is calculated by different kinds of pollutants, notably CO, NO2, and SO2, which mostly generated from vehicles and industry. O3 generated from NO2 above, and sunlight, which is also known as the summer smog O3. PM10 and PM2.5 are basically just particles, with PM2.5 being more tiny and more deadly. So here is the basic graph of how Chinese agencies measure and calculate AQI because it's different for each countries. Yeah. So now I'll get on to my question. My first question is that how has air pollution changed for major Chinese cities in the recent decade? And my second question is that what are some possible influences for air pollution? First, for my data, it's 3,000 rows and 24 variables, so 24 columns. It contains basically data from stations of five cities: Shanghai, Beijing, Shenzhen, and Chengdu and Guangzhou. So these five cities are basically gigantic, huge cities in China, and that's where I get my data from. It also contains a lot of variables such as the pollutants I mentioned previously, and also the temperature, humidity, wind on that day, and other such as the date and the season. Luckily, my data does not have any blanks, so I don't need to remove those NA data. And because I noticed that the original data has units in the end, and I don't want units, so I manually renamed all the columns. Now I get on to actually analyzing the data. So first, I wanted to take a look at the average AQI over time and not getting into any specific city, but just like the overall. And I realized it's a bit hard to plot because there's just simply too much values. So I decided to take the monthly average AQI over time. Also because sometimes they take observations, multiple observations in 1 month, and sometimes they only take one observation in 1 month. So I thought that monthly average AQI would be better describing the whole data. So here's the graph for it. And in order to better visualize the trend, I also applied a smooth curve, that is the red line. You can see that throughout the decade, air quality doesn't really improve anything. Um, if only if worse, it actually the level of AQI increased, which means that pollution increased. The later part of the code is where I grouped the AQI by city because I was wondering perhaps some city have has worse pollution than others. And after I did that, I realized that the cities are basically the same, even though some cities have more variations, such as Shenzhen, and some cities have less, such as Shanghai. Overall, I would say the trend is just highly similar to the whole graph, the graph where I did not specify based on city. Yeah. And now I wanted to inspect into the actual AQI distribution by city because previously I did it by average. So now I want to take a look at the actual values. And it turns out that the values didn't really change. It was basically the same for all city. All city has about, mm, I would say 240-ish AQI if you look on average. And it's a bit higher for Shanghai, but yeah, that could be ignored. It's not that serious. And on the right here, I was turning more into the second question of what actually influences the AQI. So I plotted by season. And I was thinking that perhaps it would be worse in the winter because of weather, but it turns out that season isn't a very big deciding factor for AQIs. Then I went on to explore the other variables that I have in my data set, such as temperature, humidity, wind speed, and pressure. Did a very simple linear regression model. However, the p-values of the models are extremely big, so I don't think any of this result is significant, and it's not really related to the AQI being measured. So I was wondering, because previously it was all basically monthly and stuff, what about hourly average? Because the data also provides hour data on it. And it turns out that the AQI actually varies a lot when you expect it on the day frame. It especially peaks at 7 to 8 a.m., which is reasonable because people go to school and work. So there's a lot of cars on the road on these days. And it's generally the same for weekday and weekends, with the weekends being slightly higher. Now I go on to inspecting the weather condition, and it turns out, again, like all the results before, weather doesn't really influence the AQ on that day, except for rainy days, slightly lower, probably because rain wash away PM 2.5 and PM 10 particles. So, in conclusion, for my first question, air pollution level has not decreased and instead increased slightly throughout the decade. Not a very positive conclusion, but when you analyze it from cities' perspective, it varies a little bit, with Beijing having lower AQIs on average. And what are some possible influences from the variables that I have from my data set? Pollution level, AQI score in this case, doesn't seem to be influenced much by temperature, season, and weather conditions, except I can argue a bit for rainy days. And it varies a lot when you inspect it hour by hour, with a peak at 7 to 8 a.m. Some limitations for my observations that I only have data for major cities, so it's not general for whole China. And it is too big. So for future explorations, it's possible to dive deeper into perhaps each day and explore more data and even build models for prediction. Here's some acknowledgement and references. I got the data set from Kaggle. And thank you very much for listening to my presentation.